I never knew one sound could split a life clean in half until I felt the sting of her palm crash across my face. It wasn't just a slap, it was a punctuation mark, the kind that ends a chapter you didn't even know you were living in. My cheek burned, my ears rang, and for a moment I thought the world had gone silent until I heard her voice slicing the air behind it. "Sign the papers or get out of my house." Helen's shrill command ricocheted around the living room, bouncing off the marble floors and the glass shelves filled with things she didn't earn. She grabbed my shoulder with nails so sharp they dug into my skin as if she wanted to carve her ownership into me. The papers lay on the table between us. Transfer of ownership. Sign here. Surrender everything. I knew she wanted my father's company, his buildings, his legacy, his last name, his life, everything he'd built in 58 years of sweat and stubborn belief, and all she needed was my signature. "Do it," Vanessa hissed behind her like a shadow with lip gloss and practiced cruelty. My hand shook as I reached for the pen, not because I intended to sign, but because I had no idea how to escape. I was exhausted, hungry, bruised from the days trapped upstairs with barely any water. The walls felt like they were closing in, and my own heartbeat sounded like footsteps chasing me. Then it happened. The moment that would flip the entire story on its head. The front door didn't open. It exploded. A thunderous crack shot through the house as the door flew back on its hinges and slammed against the wall so hard Helen actually jumped. A man stepped inside like he owned the place, tall, dark suit, hair slightly disheveled as if he'd been running or fighting or both, and those eyes, storm gray, sharp, locked instantly on mine as if he'd been looking for me his whole life. "What the hell?" Helen started, but the man didn't look at her, not once. His attention was entirely on me, and something flickered across his face, relief, anger, protectiveness so swift I wondered if I imagined it. Then he spoke, and every breath in the room froze. "Touch my wife again," he said, his voice low and lethal, "and you'll regret it." Wife. The word hit me harder than Helen's slap. My brain skidded to a halt. I stared at him, stunned, confused, trembling so hard the pen slipped from my fingers and clattered to the floor. "Wife?" I whispered, though no one heard except me. Helen spun around, her face contorting in outrage. "You're what?" The man stepped forward, shoulders squared, calm as a man delivering a death sentence. "I'm Adrian Cole," he said, "and she is my legally wedded wife." I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. My mind scrambled, searching desperately for any memory of this man, anything at all, but all I found was static, dark fog, and the echo of a pain I couldn't place. Helen's mask cracked, and the rage underneath spilled out raw and unfiltered. "She's not married," she shrieked. "This is fraud. Get out of my house, you have no right." "More right than you," he cut her off sharply. "Now step away from her." And then everything unraveled at once. Vanessa lunged toward her phone, probably to call someone, maybe the police, maybe the lawyers she and her mother were so proud of. Helen grabbed the papers and threw them at the floor as if flinging evidence of her greed would hide it. I was shaking uncontrollably now. The room felt too small, the lights too bright, my skin too tight. Adrian reached me first. Not touching, just standing close enough that his presence felt like a shield. His voice softened, drastically different from the one he'd used at the doorway. "Nora," he said quietly, "you're safe now. I'm taking you out of here." I don't know you," I managed, my throat raw. He nodded, as if he expected that. "I know, and I'll explain everything, but not here." Helen lunged forward, grabbing my arm. "She's not going anywhere." Adrian's expression turned to steel. He stepped between us, pried her hand off me like removing dirt from a window, and lowered his voice to a chilling whisper. "If you touch her again, I swear, you'll wish the police get to you before I do." Something in his tone dead calm, absolute, made Helen actually recoil. For a brief, fleeting second, she looked almost afraid. Just 1 second, but I saw it. And then we were moving, Adrian guiding me toward the door, my legs barely holding me up. Vanessa shouted behind us. Helen threatened lawsuits, prison, ruin, everything she could think of. But none of it mattered. The world outside hit me like a rush of cold water. Fresh air, night sky, wind on my face. Freedom. Or something close enough to taste like it. Adrian opened the door of a sleek black car and helped me inside. My hands were still trembling so violently I had to hold them under my thighs to keep them still. The leather seat felt soft, warm, safe foreign concepts after days locked in my room. Once the doors closed, the world went quiet except for my own uneven breathing. I watched him walk around the car, his silhouette framed by the streetlights, and every step he took felt impossibly calm for a man who had just broken into a house and declared himself my husband. When he slid into the driver's seat, he didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he looked at me, really looked, and for the first time that night, I saw something in his eyes that terrified me more than Helen's slap. Recognition, familiarity, as if he meant it, as if he believed I belonged to him. "Nora," he said softly, "I know you don't remember. I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to trust me for 1 hour. Just one. Can you do that?" My back pressed against the seat, my heartbeat loud in my ears. My voice was barely a whisper. Why are you calling me your wife?" The corner of his jaw tensed. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel, and he said the sentence that dropped my world straight through the floor. "Because 3 months ago," he whispered, "you begged me to marry you." I didn't speak, couldn't speak. My vision tunneled. The air felt thick as water, and all I could do was stare at the man claiming to be my husband while every memory in my mind dissolved into fog. He exhaled slowly, turned the key, and the engine purred to life like a dark secret stirring awake. "I'll explain everything," he said, "but not here." And as the car pulled away from the house where my life had just shattered, I stared at the window, watching the lights blur past, realizing something far more terrifying than Helen's cruelty. I had absolutely no idea what had happened to me for the last 3 months, and somehow the only person in the world who knew the truth was a man I didn't remember marrying. The city blurred by in streaks of light and shadow as we drove, the kind of late-night quiet that makes every passing car feel like an intruder. I pressed my forehead lightly against the cool glass, trying to steady my breathing, counting each inhale and exhale like it might anchor me to something real. My cheek still throbbed from Helen's slap, but that pain felt almost distant compared to the knot of terror tightening deep in my chest. I kept stealing glances at him, Adrian. If that was really his name, silhouette sharp against the dashboard glow, jaw set, eyes fixed on the road. He drove like a man who knew exactly where he was going and exactly what he intended to do when he got there. I envied that certainty. I didn't even know who I was supposed to be anymore. "You're too quiet," he said at last, not taking his eyes off the street. His voice had shifted back to something gentler, like the smooth side of a blade. "That's not like you." A chill crawled up my spine. "You say that like you know me." He glanced over, then returned his attention to the road. "I do." I swallowed hard. "I don't know you." He nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself. "I figured the moment you looked at me like I was a stranger. You didn't fake that." "Why would I fake anything?" I shot back, anger bubbling up through the fear. I woke up one day and my father was dead. 2 weeks later, I'm being slapped and starved in my own house. And then some billionaire kicks down the door and calls me his wife. "Forgive me if I'm not performing to your expectations." The corner of his mouth twitched something between a grimace and a ghost of a smile. "That sounds more like you." "You keep saying that," I snapped, "like you own some version of me I've never met." He didn't answer, just pulled the car into a sweeping driveway lit by soft golden lights. I blinked when I saw the building, a hotel I'd only ever seen in magazines, with tall glass walls and a lobby that glowed warm and expensive even from the outside. Of course, billionaire. The word sat heavy in my mind, tangled with every stereotype I'd ever heard about power and money and people who could make problems disappear with a phone call. "Why are we here?" I asked. "Because you're not safe at that house," he said simply. "Because I can guarantee your safety here. And because this is where you stayed before." My hand froze halfway to the door handle. "Before what?" He looked straight at me, his eyes searching my face as if he might find the missing pieces there. "Before you disappeared." The word settled over me like a wet blanket. Disappeared. As if I'd simply been erased. As if someone had taken a marker and blacked out 10 pages of my life. He came around to my side, opened the door, and offered his hand. I hesitated for a heartbeat, then put my palm in his, more out of necessity than trust. His hand was warm, steady, grounding in a way that made my throat tighten unexpectedly. The lobby smelled faintly of citrus and polished wood. Everything was quiet, muted, the kind of place where people spoke in low voices and nothing truly bad was supposed to happen. A few staff members glanced up when we walked in, and I watched their faces soften in recognition not of me, but of him. "Good evening, Mr. Cole," one of them said. "Your suite is ready as always." As always. The words scraped across my nerves. How many times had he been here without me? Or worse, how many times had I been here and simply didn't remember? The elevator ride to the top floor felt too short and too long at the same time, the soft hum of the machinery underscoring the pounding in my chest. When the doors opened, he led me down a quiet hallway to a door at the end. He used a key card, and the lock beeped softly, the sound weirdly intimate. The suite was beautiful in a way that almost offended me, floor-to-ceiling windows looking over the city, soft gray furniture, a bed big enough to sleep an army, dim lamps casting a warm glow over everything. It smelled faintly like coffee and cologne and that expensive hotel air that never quite smells like anything real. Adrian closed the door behind us and turned the deadbolt with a quiet click. I flinched. "You're safe here," he said quickly. "No one can get in without going through me first." "That's exactly what someone dangerous would say," I replied, arms wrapping around myself. He winced. "Fair point." He moved farther into the room, giving me space, then gestured toward the sofa. "Sit, Nora, please. You look like you're about to fall over." I hadn't realized how weak my legs felt until he said it. The room tilted for a second, and I sank onto the couch, fingers knotting in the hem of my shirt. He sat across from me, not beside me, keeping the glass coffee table like a neutral border between us. For that small mercy alone, I was grateful. "Okay," I said, after a long moment where only the distant hum of the city filled the silence. "You said I begged you to marry me." He nodded once. 3 months ago." "I don't remember that," I said, the words tasting like metal. "At all." "I know." His gaze was steady, unwavering. "That's the part that scares me." "Scares you?" I laughed. A short, brittle sound. "I woke up in a nightmare I didn't sign up for and you're scared?" "Yes," he said calmly. "Because people like me don't usually get blindsided. I do my homework. I see threats coming miles away. But you showed up in my office one day shaking, saying someone wanted you dead, asking me to marry you so they couldn't touch you. And then you vanished like you were never there. That's not normal. That's not random. That's designed." My pulse stumbled. "Start from the beginning," I said quietly. "The beginning as you remember it." He leaned back slightly, eyes drifting past me as if he was replaying a memory on some invisible screen. "You walked into my office on a Tuesday morning," he said. "No appointment. My assistant tried to turn you away. You insisted. Said it was life and death. You looked different from tonight. Tired, scared, but focused. Like someone standing on the edge of a cliff who'd decided jumping was better than being pushed." I swallowed. "What did I say?" "You told me your name, that your father was sick, that your stepmother was suddenly very attentive, insisting on making all his meals, hovering around his medication. You said something felt off, that his symptoms didn't match what the doctors were saying. You'd had some of his food tested at a private lab." He paused, eyes meeting mine. There were traces of arsenic. The room seemed to shrink. My fingers went numb. Somewhere in my head I heard my father's laugh, saw his hands holding blueprints over the kitchen table, smelled his cologne mixed with fresh coffee. "No," I whispered, but it sounded weak even to my own ears. "The doctor said heart attack. Sudden, unexpected. Arsenic poisoning mimics heart problems," Adrian said quietly. "In small doses over time, it looks like a heart giving out under stress. By the time anyone suspects, it's usually too late. You knew something was wrong before anyone else did. That's why you came to me." I pressed a hand to my chest, as if I could steady the storm inside. "Why you?" His mouth twitched. "Because I have a reputation for fixing things money isn't supposed to fix. Helping people with problems they can't bring to the police yet. Or ever. You came in with this insane proposal. A marriage of convenience. You said if you were someone powerful's wife, your stepmother couldn't make you disappear without consequences. that it would buy time while you gathered more proof. You offered me a deal I couldn't entirely refuse. What kind of deal? I asked, voice thin. He hesitated, then shrugged one shoulder. You have your father's company, connections, influence. You promised long-term business cooperation in areas I was interested in, but that wasn't why I agreed. Then why? His gaze softened, and it unsettled me more than all the steel in his voice earlier. Because you looked at me like I was your last lifeline, he said simply, and because I know what it's like to have your life ripped out from under you by someone who's supposed to protect you. I believed you. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingertips into my temples, chasing any fragment of that day in his office. Nothing, just a dark fog, like someone had dropped ink into clear water and watched it spread until everything blurred. We had a small courthouse ceremony, he continued, voice low and measured. Judge, witnesses, paperwork, all legal. You stayed here afterward, in this suite, for a few days under my protection while you figured out your next move. Then one day you said you needed to go back to your father's house, to get more evidence. You promised you'd be careful. We set a meeting a week later to regroup. He spread his hands, palms up. You never showed. Your phone went dark. No credit card activity. No social media. Nothing. For 2.5 months, it was like you'd fallen off the map. My stomach twisted. And you just, what? Waited? No, he said sharply. I hired investigators. We checked hospitals, shelters, morgues. We traced your stepmother's movements. And then, suddenly, 2 weeks ago, you reappeared, father dead, funeral arranged. You back in that house like nothing had happened, except something had. You were different. Different how? Slower, he said. Foggy. Your eyes didn't track the same way in the surveillance footage. You moved like someone swimming through mud. You smiled at people, but it never reached your eyes. You didn't go anywhere alone. You didn't drive. You didn't answer calls from the company's lawyer. Helen intercepted everything. I stared at him. You were watching me? I was trying to find you, he corrected. And when I realized your father was suddenly dead, and your stepmother was circling his assets like a vulture, I knew time was running out. I thought of the last 2 weeks like a film reel spliced from someone else's life. Fuzzy images. A funeral where I felt like I was moving underwater. Helen's hand at my elbow, steering me away every time someone asked too many questions. The vague, nauseating sense that days were slipping through my fingers like sand and I couldn't catch a single one. I don't remember the wedding, I whispered. I don't remember coming here. I don't remember going to your office, or that lab, or any of it. I know, he said again, and this time his voice sounded like it hurt to admit, which brings us to the part that keeps me up at night. I looked up slowly. What part? People don't just lose 3 months, he said. Not like this. Not conveniently around the time their father is being slowly killed and their stepmother is getting ready to steal everything. Memories don't evaporate. They're taken. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Taken how? He held my gaze, eyes steady, unflinching. Drugs, control, isolation. It's not just your father who was poisoned, Nora. Someone's been doing the same thing to you. Different method, same intent. A wave of nausea rolled through me. Suddenly, tiny details from the last weeks slammed into place the bitter aftertaste in the tea. Helen insisted I drink for my nerves, the way I'd wake up feeling like I'd slept for days and yet was still exhausted, the moments I'd find myself standing in a room with no idea why I'd gone there. No, I whispered, but my body already knew yes. Adrian leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, voice dropping to a low, firm line of sound. Tomorrow morning, I'm taking you to a private doctor I trust. We'll run tests. If I'm right, there will be something in your system that shouldn't be there. And if there is, he paused, letting the weight of it settle. Then your stepmother didn't just kill your father. She tried to erase you, too. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant traffic far below. I stared at my hands, at the faint crescent marks Helen's nails had left on my skin, and felt something inside me shift, not the panicked flutter of prey, but the slow, cold hardening of something else. If you're right, I said quietly, lifting my head to meet his eyes, then this isn't just about money, or a company, or a will. No, he agreed. It's about murder and control and making sure the only person who could expose it never gets the chance. I took a shaky breath, then another, trying to steady my voice. You said you wanted me to trust you for 1 hour. Yes. Fine, I said, surprising even myself with how steady the words sounded. You have your hour. Take me to your doctor. Prove it. And if you do, I swallowed the last of my fear, letting something sharper rise in its place. Then we're not just going to survive this. We're going to burn her whole lie to the ground. A flicker of something like pride crossed his face. He nodded slowly. That, he said, is the woman I married. I didn't know if I believed that. I didn't know if I believed him. But for the first time since my father died, I felt something that wasn't numbness or terror. I felt a direction, a target, a why. And as the city lights glowed against the glass and the night wrapped around the hotel like a dark curtain, I realized this wasn't just the story of what had been done to me. It was the beginning of what I was going to do back. The lights in the suite were too soft for the way my thoughts felt when I finally lay down, too sharp for the things that started crawling out of the dark corners of my mind the moment I closed my eyes. Sleep came in jagged pieces, not a gentle slide but a series of falls down a stairwell, off a cliff, into water I couldn't see the bottom of. I dreamed of doors that wouldn't open and hands holding me under, of my father sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold, lips moving but no sound coming out. I woke up twice with my heart galloping, disoriented, reaching for a phone that wasn't there, a glass of water that wasn't mine. The third time I woke, it was because someone was knocking. 3 soft taps, not the violent pounding of the night before. For a second, panic flared Helen, come to drag me back, but then I heard Adrian's voice, low and careful through the door. Nora, it's me. I brought coffee. It was barely morning. The sky outside the windows was that dull, washed-out blue that feels like the world hasn't made up its mind yet. I wrapped the hotel robe tighter around me and shuffled to the door, every muscle in my body heavy from tension rather than rest. I cracked it open, peeking out as if something monstrous might be in the hallway with him. It was just Adrian, freshly shaved, shirt sleeves rolled to his forearms, tie loose around his neck. He looked annoyingly awake for a man who'd just detonated my life. The smell of coffee hit me, dark and rich and grounding. He held out a to-go cup. Peace offering, he said. I stared at it, then at him. I'm assuming you didn't let my stepmother prepare it. His lips twitched. I made the barista taste it in front of me. I blinked. You're kidding. I am, he said, but I did watch them make it. The joke landed just enough to loosen something in my chest. I opened the door wider and let him in. He didn't comment on the fact that the bed behind me looked barely slept in. I curled up on the couch with the coffee cupped in both hands like a talisman. It was hot enough to almost hurt, and I welcomed the sting. It made me feel present, real. The car will be ready in 20 minutes, he said, perching on the armchair opposite. The doctor knows we're coming. This doctor, I said slowly. You trust him? With my life, Adrian said, and now with yours. I took a sip, swallowed, and felt something else rise in my throat. Fear, yes, but also a strange anticipation, like standing in front of a locked door knowing that when it opens, you might not like what's on the other side, but you can't live with not knowing anymore. What if there's nothing there? I asked quietly. What if all this is just grief and stress and I'm broken on my own? Then we deal with that, he said. No hesitation. But if there is something there, we need to know. Ignorance doesn't protect you, it just blindfolds you. I thought of my father then, how he used to say the same thing about construction, how a crack you ignore doesn't stop existing just because you paint over it. It just waits. Okay, I murmured. Let's find the cracks. The clinic was hidden in one of those glass towers where everything inside looks too clean to belong to real life. It wasn't the kind of place with crowded waiting rooms and buzzing fluorescents, but the quiet, expensive kind where anonymity was part of the service. The receptionist recognized Adrian instantly and didn't ask for an insurance card. That told me everything I needed to know about the type of people who normally walked through these doors. Doctor? Lewis is expecting you, she said with a polite smile. And within minutes a nurse led us down a hushed corridor to a private examination room. The doctor was older, with kind eyes and a face lined from years of concentration rather than worry. He shook my hand and introduced himself with a calm that made my shoulders drop a fraction. "I've worked with Mr. Cole for a long time," he said. "He tells me you've had some gaps in your memory, and there are concerns about possible interference." "That's a nice way to say someone might have been drugging me," I said. If he was startled by my bluntness, he didn't show it. "Sometimes we cushion things because the truth is heavy," he replied. "But yes, that's what we're looking into." They drew blood, took urine, asked me a series of questions that felt like someone trying to map a house in the dark. "What's the last date you remember clearly? When did your father start getting sick? Have you experienced dizziness, confusion, lost time?" Every answer I gave felt like a stone dropping into water, sending ripples backward rather than forward. I told him about nights that seemed to stretch on forever, mornings where I woke up with a taste in my mouth I couldn't name, afternoons at the house where time blurred until I wasn't sure if it was Tuesday or Friday. I told him about the funeral, how the whole day felt like someone else was wearing my skin. Adrian sat in the corner, silent, hands clasped, watching. The only time he spoke was when the doctor asked about my stepmother's behavior. That's when he mentioned the surveillance footage and the sudden change after I returned home. "I'd like to run a panel, doctor," Lewis said eventually, "for common sedatives, hypnotics, and a few less common substances known to affect memory and cognition. Some of these drugs leave markers we can see even weeks after use. If something's been in your system regularly, we should pick it up. And if you don't," I asked, "then we have other reasons to consider," he said gently. "Trauma can fragment memory too, but one step at a time." He excused himself to start the tests, leaving me alone with Adrian in the quiet, sterile room. I stared at the bandage on the crook of my arm, tiny and white and ridiculous considering the size of the question we were trying to answer with that blood. "Do you ever get tired of being right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Constantly," he said dryly. "It's a terrible burden." I almost smiled. Almost. The longer we waited, the more restless I became. I paced the length of the room, the rubbery floor making no sound. Every shadow in the corners looked like it might hide a memory if I stared hard enough. I tried to push my mind back, to that Tuesday he'd described, to the lab results, to the moment I supposedly stood in front of him and asked a stranger to marry me. All I got was a headache forming behind my eyes. "Don't force it," he said. "Memories aren't like files you can drag out of a folder. Sometimes they come when you stop chasing them." "That's convenient," I muttered. But I sat down again, palms flat on my knees. We didn't have to wait long. For high-end clinics that deal with urgent secrets, time is part of the luxury. "Doctor," Lewis came back in with a tablet in his hand, and that particular set to his mouth that says a doctor has found something and is now weighing how to drop it gently. My heart climbed into my throat. "Well?" I asked, too quickly. He looked at me over the top of the tablet. "You were right to come in," he said. "There are traces of a benzodiazepine in your system, specifically flunitrazepam. You may know it by another name, Rohypnol." The word landed like a stone in the center of my chest. I'd heard it before, in whispered stories and warnings on campus, in news reports about terrible things happening to women in bars, in cautionary speeches about never leaving your drink unattended. I never imagined it in my own bloodstream, administered not by a stranger in a club, but likely by someone who shared my table in my home. "That's a date rape drug," I said numbly. "It's a powerful sedative," Dr. Lewis corrected gently, "that can cause significant drowsiness, confusion, disinhibition, and anterograde amnesia, meaning difficulty forming new memories. The levels in your blood are low but consistent with repeated dosing over a period of time. My guess? You were given small amounts regularly. How long?" My voice barely rose above a whisper. "Based on the metabolites we're seeing, I'd estimate several weeks, possibly months. It's difficult to be precise, but this isn't a one-time exposure. This is a pattern." The room wavered. I gripped the edge of the chair to keep myself anchored. Can it erase 3 months?" "Erase is a strong word," he said, "but it can certainly make them difficult to access. Think of your memories as files in a cabinet. The drug doesn't burn them, but it may have thrown them all into a dark room and scattered them. Given time and the right conditions, some of them may come back. Others might stay blurry. but the fact that you're already experiencing fragments is a good sign. Fragments, I repeated. Little shards of glass on the floor of my mind. Dangerous if stepped on, but proof that something broke. Can you document it? Adrian asked, practical as ever. Legally? Dr. Lewis nodded. You'll have a full report. Lab results, interpretation, timelines. And, with your permission, I can testify to my findings if this ever goes to court. Oh, it's going to court, Adrian said, a razor edge under his calm, and beyond. I barely heard them, because in that moment, as the doctor's words settled around us, something inside me shifted again, not the slow, dawning realization of the last few days, but a sudden sharp click, like a lock turning. My throat went dry. Water, I murmured. Dr. Lewis handed me a small paper cup. As I lifted it to my lips, the position of my hand, the tilt of my head, the faint scent of whatever generic purifier they used, they all collided with something buried. Suddenly, I wasn't in the clinic anymore. I was in my father's bedroom. The air smelled like antiseptic and overripe fruit. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a thin spear of afternoon light that sliced across his face. He looked smaller than he'd ever looked in his life, swallowed by the bed, skin sallow, eyes a little too bright. Helen stood by the nightstand, smiling a soft, practiced smile, a glass in her hand. Just a little something to help you sleep, darling, she cooed. You've been so restless. She handed him the glass. He drank obediently, trusting, because why wouldn't he? She sat on the edge of the bed, touching his shoulder. Her hand lingered near the IV line. My stomach turned. I remembered standing in the doorway, watching, something uneasy crawling up my spine. Later that night, I remembered finding the empty blister packs in the trash. The labels didn't match the prescriptions I'd seen on his chart. I remembered my heart pounding as I scooped them into a bag, hands shaking, telling myself I was being paranoid, telling myself I would feel ridiculous when the lab said everything was fine. I blinked, the fragment dissolving, and found myself back in the clinic, the paper cup crumpling in my fist. You okay? Adrian asked, already halfway out of his chair. I nodded, though I clearly wasn't. I remembered something, I said hoarsely. Her. By his bed. The pills. I took them. I sent them somewhere to be tested. I swallowed. I think the results came back. I think that's when I went to you. Dr. Lewis watched me carefully. Good. That's good. It means your brain is starting to reconnect the dots now that the drug is clearing. How long until it's all out of my system? I asked. Physically? A few weeks for the last traces. Mentally? He gave a small, regretful smile. That's harder to say. Some memories may come back fully. Others will feel like looking through frosted glass. But with time, safety, and some help, we can try to bring as much back into focus as possible. Safety. The word tasted fragile. Outside this clinic, nothing about my life felt safe. Not my home, not my family, not even my own mind. Adrian stood, rolling his shoulders as if preparing for a fight. Send the full report to my office, he said, and a copy directly to Nora. No intermediaries. The doctor nodded. Of course. As we walked back through the corridor, the walls seemed closer than before, not threatening exactly, but dense with the weight of what we now knew. The elevator doors closed, and I stared at my reflection in the metal pale face, bruised cheek, eyes that looked older than they should for 23. You were right, I said quietly, watching my lips move. Somebody did this to me on purpose. Yes, Adrian said. There was no satisfaction in his voice, only grim confirmation. Which means you were right about your father too. You didn't imagine any of it. The doors opened into the lobby. People moved around us, unaware that the girl walking past them had just discovered parts of her life had been chemically stolen. Outside, the air felt colder even though the sun had climbed higher. We walked to the car in silence. It wasn't until we were both inside, doors shut, that I turned to him. You said you had investigators watching the house, I reminded him. Did they see anything? Anyone coming and going? Something that might tell us where she kept me before she brought me back? He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. They have a list of properties connected to Helen rental units, a lake house, a storage facility under a shell company. We haven't checked them all yet. We will, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my own voice. Because if she kept me somewhere, there might be traces, footprints, something I left, and I want to know exactly how she did it. He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. We'll go through everything, one by one, but there's something we need first. What? Proof she killed your father, he said. Proof that doesn't rely on your memories or mine. Something a jury can watch and not look away from. A chill slid down my spine, but beneath it, something sparked a flicker of memory, not fully formed, but insistent. A room, a fireplace, a loose brick my father had once shown me when I was 8 and afraid of monsters in the walls. I think, I said slowly, the pieces beginning to arrange themselves. I know exactly where to start looking, because somewhere in that house, behind a wall or under floorboards or hidden in plain sight, there was more than just missing time. There was evidence, and if my stepmother thought she could drug me into forgetting where I'd hidden it, then she'd made one mistake she couldn't erase. Under all the chemical fog and fear, I was still my father's daughter, and he had taught me to build things that were meant to last, even the traps. We didn't go back to the hotel right away. Instead, we drove aimlessly for a while, or at least that's how it felt to me turn after turn, the city shifting from glass towers to quieter streets, my thoughts pacing faster than the car. At some point, Adrian pulled over in front of a small park, the kind with bare trees and empty benches, the kind that exists more in memory than in photos. He didn't turn off the engine, just rested his hands on the wheel and waited. You said you know where to start, he reminded me gently. With proof, I stared out at the swings creaking in the wind, at the lone jogger cutting through the cold morning air, and tried to hold on to the fragile thread that had surfaced in the clinic. A fireplace, a brick, my father kneeling beside me when I was 8, his hand warm on my back as he showed me how one square of the world could be moved if you knew where to push. In my old bedroom, I said, my voice sounding far away. There's a fireplace decorative, mostly. We never used it. One summer when I had a nightmare about monsters in the walls, my dad showed me a loose brick in the hearth. He said if I ever got scared, I could hide my diary there. Somewhere nobody else would think to look. I swallowed, tasting ash and memory. If I found proof she was poisoning him, that's where I would have put it. Adrian nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd been hoping for. Then that's where we'll go. We can't just walk in, I pointed out, the practical fear kicking in. Helen will be there. Or Vanessa. Or the staff. I don't exactly have a key to my own house anymore, if you haven't noticed. You don't need one, he said. I have a team for that. The way he said it made a strange kind of sense. Billionaires don't call locksmiths. They call people who make locks irrelevant. He pulled out his phone and sent a few messages, his thumbs moving with the efficiency of a man who was very used to onboarding crises. Within minutes, he had what he wanted. They'll meet us 2 streets over from the house in an hour, he said. In the meantime, you need to eat something. You're running on fumes. I wanted to argue, but my stomach betrayed me with a low, hollow growl. Days of Helen's twisted version of discipline had left me lightheaded, and the hospital coffee was starting to feel like it was burning a hole through an empty space. We grabbed something quick at a small cafe, toast, eggs, nothing fancy, and for the first time in weeks I tasted food without wondering if it had been tampered with. I still watched the waiter pour my orange juice like a hawk, though. Trust, I was learning, was a muscle that had to be rebuilt, not flipped on with a switch. The closer we got to the house, the tighter the band around my chest drew. By the time Adrian parked on a quiet side street lined with winter bare trees, my hands were shaking again. The house rose at the end of the block, stately and familiar, and now a crime scene in everything but tape. My childhood in brick and stone. My father's laugh etched into the windows. My stepmother's lies woven through the curtains. 2 men and a woman were waiting beside a nondescript gray van. They looked like the kind of people you wouldn't remember if you passed them twice. Neutral clothes, practical shoes, hair pulled back, faces unremarkable save for the sharp alertness in their eyes. Adrian introduced them by first names only, Michael, Santi, and Jenna. Security and recovery specialists, he added for my benefit. Think of them as very ethical burglars. We prefer the term covert retrieval professionals, Jenna said dryly. but there was a flicker of humor there that made her seem less like a character in a spy movie, and more like a person who might go home and eat cereal in front of the TV. Still, when she looked at the house, her gaze was all calculation. "You're sure about the brick?" she asked me. "Exact location? Height? Angle?" The questions calmed me in an odd way. They were practical, solvable. "My bedroom is on the second floor, third window from the left," I said, pointing. "The fireplace is on the wall opposite the bed. The loose brick is on the right side of the hearth, third row from the bottom. It sticks out just a hair more than the others. You have to press down on the top edge and pull at the same time." Saying it brought back a flash of being small, my father beside me, his voice low and reassuring as he guided my tiny fingers. "Every fortress needs a secret," he'd said. "Just in case," Michael nodded, already mapping routes in his head. "House staff?" "Minimal," Adrian answered. "A maid, a cook, a groundskeeper. But Helen likes control. They won't make waves while she's still in charge." "Alarms?" "Standard system," he said. "We have the codes. Her lawyers used my office last year for some deal. She didn't know that came with a complimentary security audit. The system hasn't been upgraded since." I shouldn't have been surprised that Adrian had already quietly broken into my life in other ways, but there was something both unsettling and comforting about it. He'd been circling this storm long before I knew it was coming. "We go in, get the package, get out," Santi summarized. 15 minutes tops." "I'm coming," I said instinctively. 3 sets of professional eyes turned to me at once. Adrian was the first to speak. "No, you're not." Heat flared in my chest. "It's my house, my father, my life. You're asking me to just sit in a van while strangers dig around in my childhood?" "Yes," he said. "Because if something goes sideways and Helen comes back or calls someone or the staff panic, you are the one person who cannot be caught there. Right now, legally, you're a grieving daughter who left a volatile situation with her stepmother. If she gets even a shred of evidence that you've been sneaking around the house with a private team, she'll twist it into something ugly. Let us be the ghosts. You stay clean." I hated that he was right. I hated it so much that my eyes stung. "You said I'm not helpless," I reminded him, fingers curling into fists. "You're not," he said quietly. "You're strategic. And right now, the smartest strategy is for you to not be on the field. Let us do the part we're good at so you can do the part only you can do later." "What part is that?" "Telling the story," he said, "in a way that makes the world listen." Something in those words settled the fight in me, not because it made me smaller, but because it made me feel necessary. Not as bait, not as collateral, but as a voice. My father had always said that the right words, at the right time, could move people more than any bulldozer. "Fine," I exhaled. "But if you break anything in there, I'm haunting all of you." Jenna saluted with 2 fingers. "We'll be gentle," she promised. "We know we're walking through someone's memories." They moved with impressive efficiency. Michael and Santi approached the house along the side, staying low behind the hedges. Jenna stayed in the van with a laptop, eyes flicking between camera feeds and a blueprint of the alarm system's guts. Adrian and I sat in the back seat of his car, close enough for me to feel the tension radiating off him, far enough that our shoulders didn't touch. "They're in." Jenna's voice came through a small earpiece Adrian wore. He'd offered me one too, but I'd refused. Somehow listening in felt more invasive than I was ready for. I watched the house instead, focusing on the familiar lines of the roof, the way the morning light hit the windows I used to press my forehead against, counting cars as they went by when I was bored or lonely or both. Minutes stretched. My nails left crescents in my palms. At one point a bird landed on the front steps, hopped twice, and flew away, and I almost laughed from the absurdity of the fact that the world just kept going. "They're in your room," Adrian relayed quietly, listening. "Fireplace located, brick located." I held my breath. The house didn't explode. No alarms screamed. No cars roared into the driveway. The silence felt like waiting at the top of a drop. "Got it," he said suddenly, a small smile ghosting over his mouth. "They're on their way out. 2 minutes." My knees went weak with relief so intense it felt like nausea. I pressed my forehead against the window, eyes stinging. "He really showed you that brick when you were 8? Adrian asked, voice softer. "Yeah," I said. I had this nightmare that something was clawing its way out of the wall. I couldn't sleep, so he took me to the fireplace, pushed the brick, showed me the space behind it. He said even walls can have secrets and that if anything ever scared me, I could put it in there on paper. And if it ever came back out, it would have to face the light first. Smart man, Adrian murmured. The smartest. My throat tightened. She thought she could erase him, but he built everything to last, even the hiding places. True to their word, 15 minutes later, the team was back. Michael climbed into the van first, followed by Santi, who held a small anti-static bag like it was made of glass. Inside was a micro SD card, tiny and unremarkable, the sort of thing people lose under furniture every day of the week. Except this one, if we were right, held the difference between suspicion and proof, between grief and justice, between a heart attack and murder. We didn't plug it in right away. Adrian insisted we leave the neighborhood first. He had no intention of giving Helen free evidence of anything if we could avoid it. Only when we were back in the safety of the hotel suite, curtains drawn, doors locked, did he slide the card into a secure reader and connect it to his laptop. "You okay?" he asked me, fingers hovering over the trackpad. "No," I said honestly, "but do it anyway." The folder that appeared on screen was simple, a list of video files, each stamped with a date and time. The timestamp started 6 months before my father died. My stomach flipped. "Pick one," Adrian said. I pointed to a file about 3 months in, some instinct telling me that by then, whatever Helen had been doing would be fully in motion. The video was grainy, the angle slightly tilted, but the image was unmistakable. My father's bedroom, the camera tucked high in a corner, watching. My father lay in bed propped up against pillows, reading glasses perched on his nose, a thick book open in his hands. He looked tired, thinner, not like the man who used to jog every morning around the block with me racing behind him on my bike. Helen glided into frame a moment later carrying a tray soup, a glass of water, pills in a little blue dish. She set the tray down with a sigh, the picture of devoted concern. She spoke, but there was no audio. The camera had been visual, only, it didn't matter. I remembered her tone well enough. He thanked her. He always did. She picked up the glass of water, then paused, glancing toward the door. Slowly, she reached into the pocket of her robe, pulled out a small blister pack, and pressed 2 pills free into her hand. They weren't the same size or color as the ones in the dish. She dropped them into the glass, stirred with one of the spoons until they dissolved, then turned back to him with that soft, practiced smile. My fingers dug painfully into the arm of the couch. "Pause," I said through gritted teeth. Adrian complied. The frame froze on Helen's face, eyes bright, lips curved. "Love, if you didn't know where to look. Victory, if you did. We can get this enhanced," he said quietly. "The lab can analyze what's in that packet, match it to what was in his system, combined with your doctor's report about you. Play it," I said, jaw tight. "I need to see." She handed him the glass. He drank. She stroked his hair. He smiled weakly and went back to his book, then set it aside a minute later, eyelids drooping. She rearranged the pill dish when his eyes were closed, throwing the unused originals into a tissue and tucking it into her pocket. When she walked out of frame, she glanced vaguely in the direction of the camera without seeing it, her expression dropping into something bored and hard. The date in the corner stamped the moment in time like an accusation. "We don't need to watch all of them," Adrian said after a long silence. "One is enough to establish a pattern. The rest will just make it worse." "I want to see one more," I said. He hesitated. "Nora, please." The second video we chose was from a later date, closer to the end. This time my father looked much worse, cheeks hollow, movements slower. Helen was there again, the same tray, the same routine. But this file was longer, and toward the end, younger me entered the frame. I must have moved the camera that day without realizing it, because the angle shifted slightly as I came in, my face turned toward the bed. I watched myself cross the room, hug my father, pick up the soup spoon. Helen lingered in the doorway, eyes narrowed just a fraction as we talked. At one point my father touched my hand, his lips forming words I couldn't hear, but I could guess. "Don't trust her." The video cut off suddenly a few minutes later. like it had been manually stopped. Had I done that? Or had she noticed something was off and found a way to interrupt it? Either way, there was enough. More than enough. I sat back, feeling strangely empty and overfull at the same time, like someone had poured concrete into my chest. "We have her," Adrian said. "On video, in your father's medical records, in your blood work. This isn't just suspicion anymore. It's a case. She used to bring me cocoa at night when I was little," I said numbly. "Said it was our secret. Dad didn't like us having sugar before bed." I laughed once, a small, bitter sound. I thought it made us closer, special. "Abusers don't wear warning labels," he replied softly. "They knit themselves into your good memories so tightly you don't notice the knife until it's already in." I stared at the frozen frame of Helen caring for a man she was killing, and felt something inside me solidify. Not the amorphous anger that had been swirling since the funeral, but a clear, hard resolve with edges. "Going to the police quietly isn't enough," I said. "She'll spin it. She'll say you forced me. She'll say I'm unstable from grief. She'll drown the truth in her own performance." "Agreed," Adrian said, which is why I had another idea, a louder one. I looked at him. "How loud?" "Press conference loud," he said. "Public, controlled, with evidence they can't ignore. We show the world exactly who she is before she has time to rewrite the script. Once it's out there, the police will have to act with everyone watching. No backroom deals, no quiet settlements. Just the truth, in the brightest light we can find." The thought of standing in front of cameras, telling the world about the most painful parts of my life, made my stomach twist. But the thought of Helen standing there instead, telling her polished, poisonous version, was worse. "She'll come," I said slowly. "If we announce something that threatens her image or access to the money, she won't be able to resist." "She'll come guns blazing," he agreed. "And when she does, we won't argue. We'll just press play." I looked back at the laptop screen, at the tiny piece of plastic on the table between us that had recorded everything she thought she'd hidden. My father always said the strongest foundations are built on truth. Somewhere along the way, Helen had forgotten that. She'd built her whole future on a lie, and now it was time to see how fast it crumbled when you pulled the right brick. "Then let's invite her," I said, the words tasting like steel and something almost like hope. "Let's give her a front row seat to her own downfall." The invitations went out quietly and the storm arrived loudly. It turned out you didn't have to shout for the world to listen. You just had to whisper in the right rooms. Adrian's team drafted a statement that was deliberately vague and deliberately impossible to ignore. The Bennett family would be holding a press conference to address serious irregularities surrounding my father's death and the future of his company. Within hours, it was everywhere. The kind of people Helen cared about looked: business channels, society columns, legal blogs that loved a corporate scandal. By the next morning, the hotel ballroom we'd rented was booked solid with reporters, cameras, and the kind of onlookers who smelled blood in the water. Standing in the small side room they'd set up as a green room, I could feel the noise through the walls, a low roar like an ocean pressing against glass. My stomach twisted itself into tighter and tighter knots. "You don't have to go out there," Adrian said, adjusting his tie in the mirror. "We can release the footage without you on stage. And let them turn me into a faceless footnote in my own story?" I shook my head, fingers trembling as I straightened the simple black dress we'd chosen. No frills, no drama, just clean lines and a thin silver necklace my father gave me on my 18th birthday. "No, if I don't speak for myself, she'll speak for me." He studied me in the mirror, his reflection serious and steady. "Then we set the terms. You are not there to argue with her. You're there to talk to the cameras, the people at home, the shareholders, the jurors who don't know they're jurors yet. You tell the truth. We show them the proof. She can scream all she wants. The evidence screams louder." "What if I freeze?" I asked, hating how small the question sounded. "You won't," he said. "But if you do, I'll be standing right next to you. You can hand me the mic, and I'll take the hit. That's what partners do." The word partner slid into place between us, heavier and more significant than husband or wife ever had in the last 24 hours. For a moment, I let myself breathe into that. "She'll come," I murmured. "She can't afford not to." "She's already here," Jenna's voice came through the comm in his ear. "Arrived 10 minutes ago with her lawyer and your stepsister. She looks confident. Of course she does, I said. She thinks this is still her stage. Adrian's eyes met mine in the mirror. Let's take it from her then. The organizers gave us a 5-minute warning. I could hear the muffled click and whir of cameras being set up, the shuffle of chairs, the rustle of papers. Somewhere in that sea of noise, my stepmother was probably rehearsing the lines she'd prepared her whole life. Grief-stricken widow, devoted caregiver, misunderstood matriarch. I pressed my fingers briefly to the side of my neck where my pulse thudded wildly and tried to picture my father instead. The way he stood at the head of a boardroom table, when he knew he was about to make a decision half the room would hate but all of them would someday respect. Sometimes, he used to say, you don't wait for the ground to feel steady. You plant your feet and make it steady. You ready? Adrian asked. No, never. Yes, I said, because sometimes courage sounded exactly like a lie you chose to live into. We stepped out together. The ballroom was larger than I expected and somehow also too small to contain the energy in it. Lights, microphones, a row of cameras at the back, red recording dots glowing like watchful eyes. Journalists filled the folding chairs in front, laptops open, pens poised, every gaze calculating. I swept the room and found her almost immediately in the third row, right aisle. Helen in a tailored navy suit, pearls at her throat, makeup flawless, hair sculpted into soft waves that screamed tasteful sorrow. Vanessa sat beside her, hands twisted in her lap, eyes flicking nervously between the stage and her mother. Their lawyer, a silver-haired man with a face like a polished door, leaned back with his arms crossed, assessing. For a split second, the sight of them knocked the air out of me. My body remembered dinners at that table, holidays in that house, the way they'd once included me just enough to make the betrayal later feel like a personal failure. Then Helen saw me. Our eyes met across the tables, and in that brief lock of gaze I watched her expression flicker shock, then something like fear, then a swift smoothing into a smile that didn't touch her eyes. She hadn't expected me to be standing, I realized. She'd expected a statement from my representatives, something she could counter with her own public performance. Seeing me up here, alive and clear-eyed and not under her thumb, threw off her script. Good. I approached the podium with Adrian at my side, every step careful, deliberate. The murmur in the room dipped and then rose again like a wave. I adjusted the microphone with hands that only shook a little. Thank you all for coming, I began, and heard my own voice echo back at me through the speakers, thinner than I'd hoped, but steady. My name is Nora Bennett. I'm here to talk about my father, his death, and what's been done in his name. Cameras clicked like crickets in a summer field. I took a breath and kept going. I told them about my father the way I remembered him, not the way the obituaries had summarized him, about his stubbornness, his laughter, the way he still wore a watch even though his phone could tell him the time because he liked the weight of it on his wrist. I talked about the company he built from a contracting business out of our garage, about the pride he took in every bridge, every building, every house that had his name on the plans. I let them see the man before the victim. Then I told them about his sudden illness, the way it had crept up on us, then sprinted, the inconsistencies in his symptoms, the late-night worries that had driven me to take samples of his food, his pills, to a lab because something in my gut whispered what my brain didn't want to say out loud. I watched reporters' eyes sharpen as I mentioned arsenic. I watched a few of them glance automatically toward Helen. She sat very still, lips pressed, eyes locked on me. Her lawyer leaned forward now, fingers laced, listening. I didn't go to the police immediately, I said, voice dipping. I was scared. I thought I could gather more proof first. I thought if I moved too soon, she'd find a way to twist it. I also didn't realize how much danger I was in. I felt the weight of that admission. Shame, yes, but also a strange relief at saying it out loud. A few months ago, I went to see a man named Adrian Cole. I gestured toward him. The cameras briefly shifted their focus. He nodded politely but remained silent. I asked him for protection, I continued. He agreed. We entered into a legal marriage designed to make it harder for me to simply vanish without consequence. A ripple moved through the room, curiosity and mild scandal mixing like perfume. I let it crest and fall. Shortly after that, I disappeared anyway. I described the months that were nothing but fog in my mind. the weeks that stretched in a haze of confusion, headaches, time slipping like water. I spoke of waking up to find my father dead, my stepmother in charge, my own agency quietly stripped away. Then I dropped the word the doctor had given me. Yesterday, an independent toxicology panel confirmed the presence of flunitrazepam in my system, I said, commonly known as Rohypnol, likely administered in small doses over several weeks or months. It causes confusion. It erases short-term memory. It makes people compliant. A murmur shot through the crowd like static. Pens scratched faster. One of the camera operators glanced at me, then at Helen, then adjusted his frame. I did not consent to this, I said, letting the anger show now. I did not agree to have my memory stolen, my decisions engineered, my fear exploited. But someone very close to me benefited from my silence. I paused. The air felt thick, charged. I'm not asking you to take my word for it, I continued. My word has been doubted enough. My father's death was ruled a heart attack. I am told I am grieving and confused. So instead of asking you to trust me, I'm going to ask you to watch. Adrian stepped forward then, placing a small remote in my hand. The giant screen behind us flickered to life with a neutral blue, then black. What you are about to see, I said, the microphone catching the slight rasp in my voice, comes from a camera I installed in my father's room during a time when I feared for his safety. My stepmother did not know it was there. I clicked play. The lights dimmed slightly as the screen brightened, and there it was, my father's bedroom, my father in his bed, Helen entering with the tray. If the room had been quiet before, it now became something else entirely. You could feel hundreds of eyes narrowing at once, breaths held, jaws clenching. Even without sound, the story played out with sickening clarity. The extra pills from the pocket, the stirring, the substitution, the soft smile as she handed him the glass. I watched, but I also watched her. From the stage, I could see just enough of the third row to catch the exact moment my stepmother's face drained of color. Her lawyer's head snapped toward her, eyes wide. Vanessa slapped a hand over her mouth, shock cracking through her practiced composure. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God," loud enough that a few heads turned. When the video ended, I froze the frame on Helen's face as she looked down at the man she was slowly killing. "This is one of several recordings," I said into the stunned quiet. "There are timestamps. There are lab results. There are toxicology reports from my father's medical file that, when viewed with this footage, tell a story very different from natural causes. All of them are being turned over to law enforcement today." As if on cue, two detectives standing along the side wall invited by Adrian's legal team stepped forward. Cameras swung to catch them. The room buzzed back to life in a roar of questions. But beneath it all, you could hear one sound very clearly, the sharp, panicked inhale of a woman whose narrative had just slipped out of her hands. "This is outrageous." Helen shot to her feet, her voice slicing through the commotion. "That video is edited, taken out of context. She's always hated me, she..." "Mrs. Bennett," one of the detectives said, his tone level but firm. "I'm going to ask you to remain seated and refrain from speaking until we've had a chance to review this material privately." She ignored him, of course, turning to the nearest camera instead, tears springing to her eyes with impressive speed. "I cared for that man night and day," she cried. "I handled all his medication, his meals, everything, while this ungrateful girl ran around accusing me behind my back. She even spied on us in our own bedroom. How is that not criminal? How is this not a betrayal?" Her lawyer finally stood, placing a hand on her arm, murmuring something meant to calm her. Reporters shouted over one another, questions firing like bullets. "Did you know about the camera? How do you explain the extra pills? Why was Rohypnol found in your stepdaughter's system? Are you worried about being charged?" I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The video had already spoken. The detectives conferred briefly with one another, and with someone on the phone. It was incredible how quickly a room could shift from stage to interrogation chamber. One of them approached the podium and murmured a quiet request. Adrian nodded and handed over a copy of the files, documents already prepared in a neat folder. "At this time," the detective said loud enough for the nearest microphones to catch, "we are asking Mrs. Helen Bennett to accompany us for further questioning regarding the circumstances surrounding her late husband's death. The words weren't an arrest yet, but they were a crack in the facade. Helen's face twisted, the grief mask slipping entirely now to reveal something sharper, uglier. For a brief moment, our eyes met again. There it was, the hate she'd kept carefully veiled for years, now blazing openly. The woman who had called me stupid in the hallway, who had slapped me, starved me, drugged me. The woman who thought she could erase me. "You did this," she hissed across the room, all pretense gone. "You ungrateful little—" Her lawyer squeezed her arm hard enough that she cut herself off. The detective stepped closer, gently but firmly steering her toward the side exit away from the cameras. She went, but not quietly. "He left it all to you, and you still weren't satisfied," she shouted. "You ruined everything. This company will fall without me." I let her words wash over me without reacting. Let the cameras drink in the fury that contradicted every image she'd tried to build. Let the world decide which version of her it believed. Adrian stepped back to the microphone once she was gone, fielding the questions I couldn't have answered even if I'd tried. He spoke of cooperation with the authorities, of full transparency with regulators and shareholders, of managing Bennett Construction through the transition with integrity. Behind him I stood very still, feeling the adrenaline slowly seep out of my limbs, leaving a trembling sort of exhaustion in its wake. Somewhere in the room, Vanessa had started to cry in earnest. The sound threaded through the chaos, a high, thin note of something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief, maybe both. When it was finally over, when the detectives left with evidence, and my stepmother, when the reporters dispersed, still calling out questions, when the cameras were turned off and the lights dimmed, I stepped down from the podium on legs that felt like they might belong to a stranger. Adrian's hand hovered near my elbow, close enough to catch me if I stumbled, not quite touching unless I asked. I didn't ask. I slipped my hand into his anyway. Outside the ballroom, the hallway was almost eerily quiet. The noise of the world felt like it had been left behind with the stage. I leaned against the cool wall, pressing my head back, eyes closed, letting myself breathe. For the first time since my father died, the air tasted slightly less poisoned. "You did it," Adrian said softly. "We did it," I corrected, opening my eyes to look at him. "My father helped too, and your team, and that doctor, and whoever made that camera sturdy enough to outlive her lies." A small, incredulous laugh escaped me then, half sob, half relief. My face felt wet, and I hadn't even noticed I was crying. "It's not over," I added. "The trial, the company, the fallout, it's all just starting." "I know," he said. "But today, you pulled the first rotten beam out of the foundation. The rest will come down. It has to." I thought of the video, of Helen's face frozen on that moment of false tenderness, and of my father trusting her. I knew the road ahead would be hard and long and full of days where grief outweighed vindication. But I also knew this. For the first time, the truth wasn't trapped in my head or hidden behind a brick. It was out in the light. And once people have seen something, really seen it, it's harder to pretend it isn't there. "She tried to erase me," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. "She almost pulled it off." "She failed," he said simply. "You're still here, and now she's the one who has to answer for what she did." I nodded slowly, feeling the truth of it settle somewhere deep, somewhere the drugs never reached. For the first time, I let myself imagine a future that wasn't built on fear of what she might do next, but on what I might do instead. Not running, not hiding, building. That was what my father had taught me, in blueprints and bedtime stories and hidden bricks. If you want something to stand, you pour the foundation yourself. 6 months after the press conference, I still sometimes woke up expecting to hear her footsteps in the hallway. It was a ghost habit, a reflex my body hadn't unlearned yet, like reaching for a light switch in a house you no longer live in. The difference now was that when my heart kicked hard in my chest and my eyes flew open, I wasn't staring at the ceiling of the room she'd turned into a gilded cage. I was staring at the soft gray of a different bedroom, in a different building, in a different life. The first time I visited the prison where they were holding her, I almost turned back at the gate. It had been Adrian's idea and mine at the same time. He suggested I might want to see it with my own eyes one day. and I'd surprised us both by saying yes. Closure, Dr. Lewis had called it, though he'd also warned me that closure isn't a door slamming shut so much as a window that stops rattling in the wind. The guard checked my ID, buzzed me through, led me down a hallway that smelled like disinfectant and resignation. When she walked into the visiting room, wearing a beige jumpsuit instead of her tailored suits, she still carried herself like the center of the universe. For a wild second I thought she'd smile and pretend this was all a misunderstanding, that we were two women having a difficult but dignified family conversation. Instead, she sat down across from me and laughed once, harsh and humorless. "So," she said, folding her hands on the table, "you wanted to see what you did." "What you did," I corrected, surprised at how even my own voice sounded. "I just made sure people were looking." She rolled her eyes, the same dismissive gesture she'd used when I was 16, and asked why her name was so prominently displayed on charity galas my father had funded. "Do you feel better?" she asked. "Sleeping at night? Playing the brave little widow in your father's empire?" "I'm not a widow," I said. "And I'm not playing anything." She leaned forward, eyes sharp, searching my face for something she could still control. "You were nothing before us," she hissed. "Your father dressed you up and paraded you around, and you still would have faded into the wallpaper if I hadn't given you a model to imitate. All that power and you had no idea what to do with it." For a moment her words still stung. They brushed against old insecurities, the ones that had whispered I was always a half step behind everyone else, that I didn't deserve the boardroom my last name handed me. But then I remembered the look on her face in that ballroom when the video played, the sudden, naked fear, the knowledge, for once, that she couldn't talk her way out of the truth. "Maybe I didn't," I said quietly, "but I know what to do with it now." Her smile was slow and poisonous. "You're naive if you think this ends with me. There will always be people like me circling people like you. Men like your new husband don't stand next to a mess unless they get something out of it." "You're wrong about him," I said, and realized as I said it that I believed it fully now. That belief had come slowly, like light creeping into a room through cracks, but it had come. He already had power. He didn't need mine to feel big. "Then what does he want, Nora?" she pressed, pouncing on the crack she thought she'd found. "Nobody does anything for free." I thought of the nights we'd spent in the quiet of the new house, going over documents together, Adrian never once making a decision without showing me exactly where the numbers came from. I thought of the way he stood next to me in those first board meetings, not in front, not behind, just there, a steady presence while I learned how to speak the language my father had been fluent in for decades. I thought of the morning he'd made pancakes badly, because he saw how thin I'd gotten from living on coffee and anxiety. "What does he want, Nora?" The answer came so simply it startled me. "Me," I said. She laughed again, but there was a crack in it this time. "You think that will last?" "Maybe it will," I said, standing. "Maybe it won't. That's the risk people take when they build something together. But here's what I know. He didn't drug me, and he didn't kill my father. That gives him a head start over most of the people who've claimed to care about me." For a heartbeat, something flickered across her face, regret, maybe, or annoyance that her old tricks weren't working. Then she smoothed it away, wrapping herself back in the cold dignity she wore like armor. "You are your father's daughter," she said. "Stubborn. Sentimental. He built things that lasted," I replied. "You built a lie. Look where that got you." The guard signaled that our time was up. As I turned to go, she called after me, voice low and sharp. "You'll be back," she said. "When the shine wears off, when they turn on you, people like you always circle back to the monsters they understand." I walked out without answering. Maybe there was a time when that would have stuck, when I would have folded her words into my ribs and carried them around like truth. But as the doors buzzed open and the cold air hit my face, I realized I believed something else more. I get to decide who I circle back to. That afternoon, back at the office, the boardroom felt different, not because the furniture had changed, but because I had. The board that once looked at me like a placeholder now watched me like someone they needed to keep up with. I'd made mistakes, of course, hesitated on decisions my father would have made in a heartbeat, overcompensated on others. But I'd also listened more than I talked, asked the right questions, and learned when to say no. Adrian sat in on some meetings and bowed out of others, careful not to become the shadow puppeteer people would whisper about. We had lawyers for the legal side, PR firms for the public image, consultants for the transition, but the final signatures were mine. It was exhausting and terrifying and strangely satisfying. That night, after another long day of budgets and site inspections and one heated argument about worker safety protocols that would have made my father proud, I found Adrian out on the balcony of our house. It wasn't as big as the one I grew up in, but it was ours, chosen together. The city stretched out below, a scatter of lights and quiet noise. He stood with his hands resting on the railing, sleeves rolled up, tie discarded somewhere inside. I leaned against the doorframe for a moment, watching him, the rise and fall of his shoulders, the way his profile had grown familiar in its own right, rather than just a silhouette from a night of chaos. "She thinks I'll come back," I said, stepping out into the cool air. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. "You won't," he said. "You're not built that way." "I used to be," I admitted, moving to stand beside him. "I used to go back to situations just because they were familiar, even when they hurt. It felt easier than walking into something uncharted." "You walked into my office and asked a stranger to marry you," he reminded me. "That's not exactly clinging to the familiar." I huffed a small laugh. "Fair point." We stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching a plane blink across the sky. Somewhere below, a siren wailed briefly and then faded. Life going on, indifferent and constant. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked quietly. "What?" "All of this." I gestured vaguely, encompassing the house, the marriage, the public scrutiny, the legal storm. "You could have stayed out of it. Let me sink or swim on my own." He turned to look at me fully, his expression unusually open. "I regret not finding you sooner," he said. "But the rest? No. You walked into my life like a disaster warning and a second chance at the same time. I'd do it again." I studied his face, searching for any hint of performance. There was none, just tired, stubborn honesty. "You know I didn't marry you for love," I said. It wasn't a confession. It was a fact we'd both been living with. "I know," he said. "You married me because you were scared and smart enough to do something about it." "And you?" I asked. "Why did you say yes, really?" He exhaled slowly, eyes drifting back out over the city. "At first? Because it was a challenge. Because it offended me that someone thought they could bully you out of your own life, and I couldn't stop it. Because I saw a chance to use everything I'd built for something that mattered more than another deal." He paused, jaw tightening just slightly. Somewhere along the way, it stopped being about the challenge. My pulse fluttered. "When?" "Maybe when you yelled at me in the clinic for trying to be right all the time," he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Or when you grilled that foreman in the safety meeting and made him rewrite his entire plan because you refused to cut corners. Or when you sat outside your father's office after the funeral and admitted you were terrified you'd ruin everything, and then walked in anyway." He shrugged, almost helplessly. There wasn't one moment. It was all of them, stacked up until it felt less like a choice and more like gravity. The honesty of it hit me harder than any dramatic declaration could have. Something inside me that had been holding its breath for months finally exhaled. "I remember the wedding," I said suddenly, surprising both of us. The memory had come in fragments over the last few weeks. Sharp flashes in the shower or in the middle of a board report, my hand signing the license, the judge's bored tone, the scratchy feel of the cheap bouquet I'd grabbed on the way. Not all of it, but enough. I remember thinking this is insane and then thinking insanity is better than disappearing. "You were right," he said softly. "About disappearing? About choosing insanity with someone who was at least on your side. I considered that. The truth was, somewhere between then and now, the marriage of convenience had become something messier and realer. There were still days when we misread each other, when old wounds made us flinch in places the other person couldn't see. But there were also mornings when he made coffee exactly the way I liked it without asking, and nights when I found him asleep at his desk with proposals open for projects that would benefit the communities my father had always wanted to support. "We could do this properly," he said after a moment, the words cautious. "Someday, if you ever wanted to. A wedding where you remember the vows, where you're there because you chose it, not because you were running from something." The idea should have terrified me. It didn't. It felt far off and possible, like a bridge we might decide to build together when the ground was ready. "Ask me again when the trial is over," I said softly. "When I can look at a white dress and not think of press conferences." "Deal," he said. We stood there until the sky turned from deep blue to black, until the balcony lights clicked on automatically, spilling warm light over us. Eventually we went inside, closed the doors, shut the city out. Later, when I lay in bed, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing beside me, I realized something simple and profound. The fear that used to sit like a stone in my chest had changed shape. It wasn't gone, exactly, but it no longer dictated the terms. I thought of the girl who had walked into his office months ago, desperate and drugged and clinging to a plan she barely understood. I thought of the woman who had stood in front of cameras and pressed play on a story that had nearly been buried with her father. They felt like different people, and yet they were both me. If you're listening to this now on a bus, at your kitchen table, in a dark room where your own ghosts like to linger, I want you to hear this part clearly. You don't have to have all your memories intact to know when something is wrong. You don't need every piece of the puzzle to understand that you deserve better than the person holding the missing ones hostage. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say, out loud, that you are scared and you want help. And sometimes help arrives in a form you never imagined, with gray eyes and bad pancakes and a key to a door you didn't know you could open. My stepmother tried to steal my father's fortune, my future, and my past. She thought if she controlled the story, she controlled me. But the truth has a way of surviving, especially when you hide it in the bricks and refuse to stop looking for it. If my story has found you at a moment when you feel small or erased or afraid, I hope it reminds you that you're allowed to fight back, in your own way, at your own pace. And if you'd like to stay a little longer with stories like this about people who were almost broken and then remembered they weren't, you're welcome to stick around, to follow along, to subscribe and come back. There will be more nights on balconies, more hidden bricks, more quiet victories. Sometimes the loudest revenge is simply living a life they can't rewrite.